Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted that you are joining us for our series on Philanthropy in the City, where we explore the opportunities for innovative, creative solutions for the most pressing problems in our neighborhoods, communities, and cities. As the Center embarks on its third decade, we are excited to shine a spotlight on how philanthropy can contribute to improving the quality of life in all of our communities. You will hear from leaders from across the nation, leaders with a wide range of experiences, perspectives, and vantage points, who will share their insights and ideas for building more vibrant, equitable, and resilient cities. A fundamental change in philanthropy over this generation has been a focus on greater impact, not merely doing good. The beginning of this period, dating back to the mid-1990s, was marked by venture philanthropy with an emphasis on more strategic giving and nonprofit capacity building. Next came strategies to scale impact, philanthropic collaboration, public policy engagement, and partnering with government and business. And in more recent years, attention has extended to reimagining philanthropic practices, notably impact investing and prioritizing diversity and inclusion. Here at the Center, we have devoted much of our efforts to examining and assessing these strategies, where philanthropy works at the intersection of the sectors through public policy and partnerships with government and business, as well as efforts to support greater philanthropic collaboration. In the process, we have learned that the greatest opportunity for philanthropy to drive change is at the local level, in our cities and their neighborhoods and communities. It is at that scale that you can see, feel, and touch the problems. It is at that scale that you're more apt to see how the various systems come together to create a place and impact the quality of life. It is also a scale in which we can involve all of philanthropy and bring the community together from all the sectors, all walks of life to solve problems, including addressing the issue of equity. Government can't do it alone, business cannot do it alone, and surely philanthropy cannot do it on its own. We only can do it together. And at the city level, the opportunities expand exponentially across the philanthropic spectrum. Over the last year, this has come into greater focus as the issues of equity and race have been laid bare. There's an amazing possibility for our cities to meet the moment and for philanthropy to play an important role. It is our hope that this series will explore the possibilities, highlight work being done in a number of cities and their communities, and spark a conversation that shares ideas and lessons across communities. Today, as we kick off the series, we will explore the new localism, how the vitality and promise of cities and how emerging models for working across the sectors for local problem solving can play a transformative role. Today, as we wrap up our series, we address how business can contribute to more inclusive urban economies by aligning business with opportunities for economic mobility. We believe that at this moment, with its heightened urgency, it is critical that we identify promising opportunities and double down on them. It is our hope that this series will lift up new ideas, innovative approaches, and bold leadership to spark the action that is needed to realize the promise of philanthropy and the city. Let's get to it. I'm pleased to introduce my good friend, colleague, and thought partner, Elwood Hopkins. Elwood is the founder and managing director of Emerging Markets and currently a presidential fellow at the Kresge Foundation. Elwood.
When it comes to the role of corporations in American society, we often forget the historic long view. During the colonial period, corporations could only receive government charters to do business if they demonstrated a manifest social purpose. And their shareholder structures in some ways began to model representative democracy. The Massachusetts Bay Company and Virginia Company became the templates for the two state legislatures. Over time, though, the there was a strong Puritan ethic and tradition that began to separate the business and social contributions of companies. It became very common for people to say, I'm going to build wealth over here and be industrious over here, and then spend money to compensate that by doing good over here. In recent years, though, many leaders are reintegrating those two functions in some very bold ways, and seeing that corporations can not only perform both business functions and social goods, but become drivers for the economies of our cities. This is the prospect we'll be discussing with two of our favorite, most pioneering thought leaders here at the USC Center for Philanthropy and Public Policy today. Two people who are, in fact, leading the further evolution of corporate history through the work that I hope they'll share with us today. I'd like to introduce Lata Reddy, Senior Vice President, Inclusive Solutions at Prudential Financial and Chair of the Prudential Foundation, and Shamina Singh, Founder and President of the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth. Lata, Shamina, thank you for taking the time to join us today. Over the last year, I've noticed a lot of corporations. In fact, I feel like you can't even throw a stone without hitting a corporation that hasn't made a bold social declaration or commitment around racial equity or economic justice. But often these are somewhat decoupled from their core business competencies, and they're not often backed up by real changes in practices. But in contrast, the two of you really stand out as having some well-formed, integrated philosophies about the role of corporations in society. And that's where I'd like to start today. What do you think business brings to the table relative to the other sectors? Is there anything that business shouldn't be expected to bring? And is this thinking about the role of corporations embedded in your company's history, or is it a relatively recent response to changing conditions? Lata, could you start?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks, Elwood. It's great to be here and great to be in such great company with you and Shamina. So I think companies bring lots of different capabilities, and I would maybe bucket them in terms of the core capabilities that probably exist across certainly large institutions. So things like marketing skills and policy and advocacy capabilities, research and development, product development. But, I think the thing that perhaps makes this a little more unique is this notion of ecosystem thinking. And right, if you think about it, we all have customers who have needs. We have solutions or products or something that we're offering to address those needs. And we need to enter the marketplace through a distribution channel or something, right, to engage. And so without all those things coming together in a way that works, we will not be successful as a business. So I think that's something that we're able to bring to communities. Certainly, if you think about cities and the need for cross-sector partnerships and that sort of thing, I think that's something where companies have a unique competency.
Shamina, what do you see businesses bringing to the table?
Well, thanks for having me here. And it's always great to be in the same space as Lata. So I think that anything that we say here today hopefully will be interesting and additive to the conversation. But when it comes to sort of I think the unique value add of business, there's something obviously, as Lata said, about the ecosystem, but also the speed, scale, credibility. And, and if we get it right, it's also about insights, expertise, efficiencies to solve problems. The way we think about it at Mastercard, and a lot of the reason we started the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth, is actually something we call commercially sustainable social impact, which basically means doing well as a company by doing good in the world, by doing what we do best. And what I mean by what we do best in our case is bringing the data and analytics, the network, the products, the people, the marketing and the things that Lata mentioned before, along with the capital from an impact fund or philanthropic assets to leverage against a social problem. And so that takes many forms, but I think that when we get it right, it really is this idea of bringing the best assets of Mastercard together in service of solving or addressing a social problem. And I think that's why inclusive growth is, why we have the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth, because it really makes sense that Mastercard, a technology company in the payment space, would have not only a vested interest, but a vested opportunity in making sure that more people participate in the digital economy and more people survive and thrive in a digital economy than not. So that's sort of, I think, the approach is this idea of bringing all of our assets together in service of society and in addressing a social problem.
I want to go a bit deeper into that collection of assets and this idea of the ecosystem of influence you have outside the company. But first, I want to bring it home a little bit. And when corporations are critiqued and sometimes even vilified these days, it's often out of a sense, I think, of protecting working families in this country. And yet I think it's easy to forget that corporations are comprised of working people. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about, to what extent has your company been a microcosm for the transformations in the world and the problems in the world during 2020? How have you and other leaders in your company sought to respond to the community of people that are within your company? Lata, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I think if you had asked us that question a couple of years ago, we would say, of course, we're a microcosm, right, of the world. But clearly it took on different meaning, I think, with the events of last year or the past year. And so, obviously the pandemic impacted everybody, not equally, right? We know that it disparately impacted Black and Brown communities, but it did impact everyone. And the racial violence and the unrest that followed impacted everyone as well, in the sense that people were, right, there's a captive audience. We were all at home in a way that we wouldn't have been before. And so there was heightened awareness. And so all of those macro things happening were certainly taking place within the workplace as well. And so that meant leaders really needed to step up and care for our employees in a way that we hadn't had to before, right? Our employees are our greatest asset, and we've always taken pride in caring for them and their, financial wellness and all the different attributes and things that we need to provide for our employees. But that moment called for more. And so we thought about it across our employees, our customers, and our communities. And for our employees, it was, how do we make sure, again, take care of their health and safety and ensure that they do have the financial resources, whether it's caregiving that they need to provide for their loved ones or other services that they needed at this extreme moment of need. And for our customers, it was meeting them where they were and making sure that we digitized more of our offerings, made it more easily accessible, or delaying payments, right, when they had a payment due. And then for our communities, it was, again, stepping up to whether it was donations of PPE or water, right, just basic necessities for people, in addition to the cash donations that we made to direct service organizations. And I would add, we also, and the thing that I think we're probably most proud of, is we continue to pay our vendors during this time. And so we wanted to make sure that just because, right, we weren't in the building, we had the luxury of working at home, that the people who took care of us every day, our cafeteria workers and our janitorial staff, security staff, that they were able to get paid and that their employers were paying them. And similarly, we're headquartered in Newark, New Jersey. We own some real estate there, primarily our office towers, and we have retail tenants in those buildings. And so we abated the rent payments there because, by and large, they are small businesses owned and operated by Newark residents and employing Newark residents. We wanted to make sure they too can pay their employees.
Shamina?
Yeah, so I think Lata covered a lot of ground. I think for purpose-driven companies, this was it was a very unique time, right? So a lot of times I think when we're doing this work, it's easy to get it right in the good times. The test comes when something as unprecedented as I think any of us could have ever imagined, and the pandemic comes, sort of how do companies or how do individuals within those companies respond? And so I think the things that Lata talked about in terms of, for companies like Mastercard, like Prudential, sort of those that sort of have purpose at their core, this idea of, no layoffs, that was something that Mastercard was really clear about. So the financial security and the wellness of the community of people who work at Mastercard was primary. And so baseline, no layoffs. work from wherever you need to work, do whatever you need to do. How can we support mental wellness and well-being? Lots of programs around that, things around childcare, things around elder care. Unfortunately, my mother passed away during COVID, and I was one of those people who took advantage of the I think it was something like 15 days of additional leave, for COVID on top of caring for my mother and everything else. But the truth of the matter is that, when you're going through this type of, thing in the world, it's incumbent as leaders in the company, but also leaders in the community to exert influence. And I think that that's the kind of thing that, for me personally, but I think for the company, that is really important. As somebody who took it, who was very much impacted by COVID, it was also really important for us to stand with each other and stand for each other. So, at Mastercard, we did launch a racial equity initiative where, when things were happening in the United States, we did dedicate our assets of the firm to racial equity. And what does that look like? So for us, we launched a solidarity initiative where, at a minimum, $500 million in assets and grants are going towards understanding and addressing racial equity in the United States. And I think the majority of that is actually going to come out of our procurement practices. And so really thinking through, again, our role in society and our role for each other was something that we really do spend a lot of time thinking about. And I think for me, there are two things. One is it's sort of empathy in action. So never forgetting that we're human beings and doing the work that's required to take care of each other as human beings. So the financial security is table stakes, but the other pieces around, going beyond the intellectual capability of an organization and moving into decency as the core value that drives the company. And again, I think in easier times, it's easier to talk about decency or equity or emotional intelligence and things like that. I think it's when the hard times come that the decency quotient, or at least the values around decency that we've developed as a community inside Mastercard really came to bear. And I saw it in action. And I think obviously there's plenty of things we could do better, but at a minimum, I think that it really did bring 19,000 employees at Mastercard closer together as a community.
I would say similarly. I mean, this notion of listening, right? And listening to the lived experience of employees took on new importance and a different kind of emotional resonance than it ever had. So, and I think the level of vulnerability that everybody felt, that leaders felt when they, right, in a way they hadn't before, and the willingness to express that, because again, we were all, right, faced with some similar circumstances. And so the way meetings opened, right, with the question of how are you doing, and this time people really meaning it and pausing to actually listen to the answer. And right, those were some profound shifts.
I think that's right. That sense of vulnerability of leaders, and and Shamina, your own personal loss, for which I'm very sorry. This is making me want to ask a more personal question, if I may, which is, you're two women of color in high-level leadership positions with stature. Has it been an opportunity for you to find new kinds of influence and support? Has it been an extra level of burden? I mean, to the extent you're comfortable answering it in a personal way, I was wondering if you might.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, it's an interesting dichotomy, right? Because at this moment in time, existing in the world as a person like anybody else and being a person of color and what that, right, brings. And then being inside a company where we do have, right, senior roles and relative privilege in terms of the positional authority that we have and the ability to speak truth to power, right, so to speak, and the need to really leverage that in this moment more. We always do, but I think at this moment, again, it called for extraordinary, right, measures. And So it, it could take a toll, right, personally, because again, you're going through things like everybody else and feeling a lot in the moment. But I think the rather than a burden, I guess I did think about it as a privilege, right? The opportunity to have people's voices heard and what we represented, right, as people of color at this firm, and being able to share that and really have people listen again in a different way.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think that one, it wasn't a burden. So I think values, leaders and values-based leadership sort of requires us to, I sort of say lead by living. Like there's nothing I can be except myself. And so, but I do think that, that we also, I feel a personal responsibility to make sure that one, our employees are seen and felt seen, and are heard and felt heard, and are taken care of from the company perspective, but also are taking care of each other. And so I think, for me, that's sort of been the work of, the center and the social impact work at the company, but also as a woman of color who is married to a woman and who has, is a first gen daughter of immigrants. I sort of, I have an experience that I think is representative of a lot of people at Mastercard, but also one that I can reflect back and so and to them. And so it's often like, I think as I think about it, it's like we can either be we can be a mirror of Mastercard, or we can be a mirror to Mastercard. And I think as, at least for me, as a gay woman of color, I kind of do both at the same time. And the benefit of being in a place that is, leading with purpose is that that's welcome. And that is actually what drives the success of the company, is this ability to, role model, but be a mirror of, but a mirror to the company at the same time.
I'd like to begin talking about some of the very ambitious strategies you're both involved with. Can you describe in a little more detail, you were both referencing the breadth of the assets and the continuum of points of contact with the ecosystems in which you live and the different funding streams that are perhaps associated with that. Can you sort of describe the arrows in your quiver, if you will, and give an example of how you organize or deploy these through specific strategies or initiatives or partnerships? Just give us a little flavor for how it works. Lata, would you jump in?
So we do think about it as a continuum, and there are multiple resources. So for Prudential, we have corporate cash, which is very flexible, and we can use it in conjunction with bright business assets. We have philanthropic dollars. We do program-related investments out of our foundation's corpus. We have an impact investments portfolio, so we're originating double and triple bottom line investments out of Prudential's or off of Prudential's balance sheet. And then we have all of our corporate capabilities, so asset management and retirement services, and then our insurance offerings. So as we think about the problems that we're trying to solve, which all ladder up to financial security, as we're a financial services firm, right? But we're thinking about inclusive workplaces, both within Prudential and outside in the world. We're thinking about accelerating economic mobility, and we're thinking about thriving neighborhoods in cities. That we're approaching it from a problem orientation. So what's the problem? What's the need? Who are the players out there who are addressing these needs? And then having that conversation to think about, okay, so how we match them up with the assets, that we can bring to the table. And, right now, I would say that every partnership we have includes 2+ of those elements. And I forgot an important one, which is human capital. So, the time, talent, expertise of our executives and our employees are a huge asset that we bring. And so one example of how that manifests, we have a partnership with our real estate investment business, which is part of our asset management umbrella, PGIM, and a global nonprofit called Youth Build. And so for those who aren't familiar with Youth Build, it works with opportunity youth, so young people who aren't formally employed or in an education system, and trains them in the construction trades and some other things, but they started in construction, and also helps them continue their education. Our real estate investment business is a development-based business in many countries. It's also global, and they are building large assets all over the world. And so we had grant funded Youth Build for many years, but saw an opportunity to work with the organization to create that last mile. So their young people are graduating from their programs with better education credentials and some job skills. So let's now create that glide path to actual employment. And so by partnering with our business, we leveraged all of their capabilities. So their employees who are serving as mentors, right, for the young people in the program. And by the way, that's a two-way mentorship. So as much as our employees are providing to the young people, they are learning a lot from them. And then we are working with the network of development partners that our business has. So that's over 200 plus developers, the largest developers in the world, who have relationships with the largest construction firms in the world. And so what we've done, right, is create, again, that path to opportunity, to real jobs, to apprenticeships with unions, to back office jobs for the Youth Build graduates. And so, again, that's an ecosystem that we have created that is now beginning to take flight. And when you think about the number of countries wherein that Youth Build is in, that can really get to some sort of scale.
It's a fantastic example. Shamina?
I mean, I think it's a fantastic example, but it shows, when you're intentional about doing this work and when your remit is to leverage the assets of the firm for social impact, there's a lot you can accomplish. So for us at the center, and at Mastercard, data and data analytics is, a huge area that we focused on. And so because we're in the payment space. And so so we're not, one, on data, we actually created a set of corporate responsibility principles around data. We call them corporate data responsibility principles, but it's basically the idea that, you own your data, you should control your data, and you should benefit from your data. And if you are working with Mastercard, we will protect your data. And so, as part of the partnership around the Center for Inclusive Growth, our ability to actually say, we're going to contribute to creating the field of data science for social impact, because we recognize that there's an enormous divide between the digital haves and the digital have-nots, the data haves and the data have-nots. And what we're trying to do is sort of say, we can partner with other organizations, but certainly aggregate the assets inside Mastercard to really actually build an entirely new field that recognizes that data science for social impact is something that we all need. And unless we solve that problem now, the divide is only going to become wider. We worked with the Rockefeller Foundation to create something called data.org. So we created a separate organization to actually attract other funders, other stakeholders to a place where they can focus specifically all day, every day on ensuring that nonprofit social sector organizations can realize the power of their data. When we look at the company more internally and look at looking at small businesses and financial inclusion, which is an area that we're also very focused on, we worked on private-private partnerships. So in this example, we worked with Unilever, who has an enormous supply chain, to help them realize the power of marginalized small businesses to gain access to credit in a new way. So if you think about it, many small businesses, many of whom are women-owned, don't have access to credit in the traditional way. So if you're thinking about a bank lending to a small business owner, oftentimes they're asking for a credit score or collateral or something that the business owner can put up to guarantee the funding. With the Unilever example, what we work with them to realize is the buying and selling behavior of their supply chain operators was actually creating a much more nuanced approach to credit worthiness, but one that is equally important. So we brought in our partner, which a banking partner in Kenya, to start to recognize that the behavior that the Unilever merchant was seeing on their platform should be considered credit worthy. So very small lending to the small shop owner to buy more stock, for example, and then paying that money back. the banks started to recognize that that pattern and practice is actually a reason to lend more and to help grow businesses. We're up to 26,000 shops in Kenya that are used as part of this, what we call the Jaza Duka, which means fill your shop platform. And we are now scaling the program to India, where we're working with other organizations there to leverage the power of new lending to small shop owners. So that's something that we're seeing benefits women disproportionately, which is just, obviously fantastic as we celebrate Women's History Month and beyond. But it's a way to bring in marginalized communities into the small business stratosphere. So those are ways in which we're lending our certainly the capital, because we think that philanthropic capital is sort of the riskiest capital on a spectrum of capital. So we're using the philanthropic capital to de-risk the lending, but then using the assets of the firm from customers, technology, products, and services, along with a partnership with another, a complementary private sector company to try to impact and influence and scale small businesses across marginalized communities. So enormously interesting. I could talk about it forever, but also I think enormously impactful.
In these two sets of stories, you both have, well, first of all, you've really illustrated the theme that I wanted to raise from the beginning, which is that while a corporation could easily and admirably support a golf tournament or an after-school program or a charitable cause, the fact that you have chosen to remain within the realm of financial security and financial inclusion and economic mobility and entrepreneurship, focus areas that are so aligned with your core business competencies, this is what's possible, the kind of scale and impact. And so I want to unbundle with a series of follow-up questions now about how this all works. And for starters, I'd like to ask, what is it like interacting with your colleagues who are in lines of business within your firm? How do they see you? How do you present yourself? How do you talk to them about ways to align some of these different efforts? Give me a little texture to that process.
So as a slightly older company than Mastercard, we, I think it's evolved, right? Because corporate philanthropy, or the concept of corporate engagement has evolved. And so those conversations have evolved with it. But I'd say now, right, it's all about unlocking growth. So if you're really a purpose-driven company, right, you understand that engaging in these societal issues are going to be a vehicle towards growth. And especially if you say, right, it's about long-term value creation versus the short-term quarterly, reporting, that these societal issues are going to intersect with your business. So it's critical to be engaged. And, our business leaders, by and large, get that. And certainly they're looking at the same statistics we are, the changing demographics, right? The purchasing power of diverse communities and underrepresented communities. And so, the Black community alone, right, an annual purchasing power of $1.3 trillion. So if people don't care about that market, right, you were leaving real money on the table. And so I think there's a broader awakening of that fact. And so it's easier to have the conversations about embedding, right, this work and using all of our assets to address these issues, because again, people understand as, profit-seeking companies that we can drive progress at the same time. And in fact, it's necessary to drive progress to get the profit.
Lata, have you ever actually set tables or convened meetings where you've had people who probably hadn't met before around ideas of social purpose, where you're actually standing in the head of the room and saying, here's what we're going to talk about today, guys? Have you played that role, and what's it like?
We have, and it was hugely instructive and great fun, just really energizing. So a couple of years ago, probably 4 years ago now, we held what we called an Inclusive Market Summit, and it was focused on Latino financial security. And so we brought in some of our partners who are experts in that space, who bring consumer insights, who bring products that they offer, distribution platforms and the like. And then the other half of the group was our business leaders. And so folks from all over the company, right? And we brought them together in large group sessions with kind of keynote, people talking about the issues of the day and the data. And then we broke up into smaller groups and mixed it up between business and the external folks, and had some really interesting conversations where we drove home internally a deeper recognition of the actual issues facing people on the ground. And then with our external partners, they had a better understanding of how companies actually think about this. So it humanized the company a little bit, but it also, right, presented a little bit better view of some of the barriers that are real, right? So they don't see them as companies making excuses anymore. It's like, oh, I get it now. That's why you say you can't do this. And then it led to real creative problem solving around, okay, right, what can we do about it then to overcome the barriers that might exist, but to get to the same result we're seeking? And then that led to follow-on work on 3 different, we kind of force ranked opportunities and arrived at 3 things that people were really interested in, and groups went off and worked them. And some, didn't pan out, but others did. And so it was really great to see.
Is it true that actual new product and distribution strategies have emerged and stayed because of the catalytic role of your part of the company?
Yeah, one quick example, we worked with our retirement business to offer an in-plan emergency savings vehicle as part of our 401k offering. And at a time when, right, millions of Americans half of Americans don't have $400 in, the face of an emergency. And so things like that, right, were generate what I just described, that process was kind of, the beginning of a set of conversations that have led to the opportunity to go to market with inclusive products.
Shamina, how about you? What about Mastercard and your interactions with the lines of business there?
It's I think similar to Lata's. I mean, at a very basic level, because this idea of financial inclusion and inclusive growth is part of the strategy of Mastercard, I think people realize that success in the company also means success on delivering against the initiatives that the leadership team and the CEO has put out. So to the extent that financial inclusion is actually a business strategy and a business goal, it is something that all business leaders across the company factor in to their work, because we are considered experts, if you will, on marginalized communities, underbanked communities, underserved communities. We're often advising our business colleagues on, we're sort of subject matter experts, and bring in subject matter experts to help advise in a way that does catalyze new product development, new business development. The other thing that I think is actually important and interesting is that very early on, when we decided on inclusive growth and financial inclusion, really started to see the connection between bringing people into the formal economy, and we'd made a commitment to bring 500 million people into the formal economy. Our CEO at the time, who's now our executive chairman, Ajay Banga, actually took this to our investor community very early, and he explained the business rationale behind expanding digital technology, and talked about the oncoming onslaught of digital technology. And he sort of said, this is where the world is going. We see it. And it is in our interest as Lata says, profit-seeking company to expand the base of how we can bring more consumers into the formal economy. And by the way, it will also impact everybody in a positive way. And so this idea of displacing cash and sort of saying, our competition, of course, we always have competition, but the bigger pot is actually, if we could displace cash because of what was coming in the digital economy, it would mean good things for investors and whatever they were looking for in terms of profit. But it would also mean good things for purpose-driven investors, our customers, and our community. So I think that this idea of aligning incentives is something that we've spent a lot of time thinking about. And so when you ask about my relationship or how we're seen in the company with our business colleagues, we're very much aligned with our business colleagues because our incentives are aligned.
I'd like to transition a little bit from that to another related question from your stories, which is around partnering with others in the private sector. There's a wonderful book by Adam Brandenburger and a colleague called Co-opetition. And in the book, they give the example of how financial institutions partnered, a lot of competing financial institutions partnered to create the Cirrus ATM system. And then they were able to, once they grew that market, they could then compete within that market for market share. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the room you see be working with other, particularly financial institutions, but any corporate partners where you see that as a field of opportunity or something that's fundamentally limited in some way?
I see it as a field of opportunity. And I think, again, if you're purpose driven, right, more is more, and you're trying to create more opportunities for more people. And we know we can't do it alone, and Mastercard can't do it alone. But if we join forces, wouldn't that be great? And Shamina and I talk, quite often, and we are doing some things together and always looking to do more. And I think that's really has to be the way forward, because the problems are too big, too complicated, and as big as our respective companies are, we're not going to be able to really get at them alone.
I agree. I think we have I think about it in two ways. Bringing private sector companies together with complementary assets to join forces to solve a problem. So sort of the Unilever example that I talked about before. But we're also members of an organization that Queen Maxima, who's the Secretary General's representative for financial inclusion, pulled together of private sector CEOs of, we sit with Pepsi and PayPal and Unilever and Ant Financial and Santander Bank and many, Rabobank and many others to sort of say, when you bring the assets of these firms together to think about financial inclusion, what does that look like? And so far, it's looked like joint, programs in Latin America, in Asia, and in other places. But it is this idea that says you should bring your assets together to, achieve exponential change. The other piece that I think you talked about, I think this piece around fintechs is interesting, right? So. We started pretty early on as a company, understanding that fintechs are our friends. And so they were sort of they were doing things and creating solutions and identifying problems that we had also seen, but that we should be joining forces together, because together we're stronger. And so we didn't necessarily see fintechs as competition at all. We see them as beacons, sort of like going forward. And I think that that's a place where, we recently acquired Finicity. And so Finicity is a really interesting company that is helping us think about creditworthiness differently, and helping understand marginalized communities and underserved communities in a way that only brings us closer to those communities, but in a way that will re-examine potentially how we deliver financial service products to those communities. And so I think that might be another area to think about is, how did we look at fintechs? How do we, think about issues related to blockchain with cybersecurity, things like that. The last example, I think, which is actually kind of interesting because it's something that I'm also pretty excited about, is that this idea of responsible fintech growth. And so what we're hearing a lot is that there are some financial services fintechs who are able to advance so quickly because they're not operating within sort of a regulated market. And so one of the things that we have been working a lot on is actually bringing the Center for Inclusive Growth together with our data responsibility principles, with our folks who look at lending and others, to sort of say, can we create a curriculum that brings sort of responsible solutions to fintechs in a way that they may not either be thinking about in the near term, but something that should be embedded into their DNA as they grow as operators in the financial services space. So that's been actually an interesting partnership across the company to say, that is a unique thing we bring to the entire equation, is this idea of responsible growth. And can we bring those assets together to actually influence fintechs from the start? And so our first component has been with the fintechs that become part of StartPath, which is our incubator, and really being intentional again about working with the StartPath participants to think about values-based creation. What does it look like to bring purpose in at the front end of your business plan, so that you don't every startup founder you hear says, I can't worry about social purpose because I got to make money. And we're actually saying, if you start from that place, you might not grow in as expansive as a way as you can. And so can we work with you as part of the incubation process to build purpose in at the very beginning?
You know, as I'm listening to the two of you, what's so exciting, I think, is that, philanthropy has always been concerned with how do we achieve impacts of scale. And usually those models are about pilots to policy. It's about impacting government. And in listening to you, what I hear is enormous scale, whether it's the training program and the kind of that employment glide path you described earlier, Lata, or the future of digitizing, technology and fintech. And so I want to ask you a question about scale, but first, forgive me, I just have to ask you to help me situate the two of you in the world of private sector leadership, because I'm starting this conversation with a sense of Lata, Shamina exceptionalism. I think Andrew Plepler's team at Bank of America, I think, is standout. Peter Scheer at JP Morgan Chase. But I'd like your help without any false modesty, please. How common is what you're doing in the private sector, this integration of things and this organizing of efforts under the idea of a purpose-driven company?
I think it's becoming more common, but I don't think it's as common as we'd like it to be. I think what's perhaps unique is the way, Mastercard Center is organized, the way the organization I lead called Inclusive Solutions is organized, right, where we have a lot of resources at our disposal, as you said, quivers or arrows in our quiver. And so what I've been seeing over the years, more companies organize themselves that way because they think they see the power of the ability to drive purpose, right, by having those things together. So, I think we may be far out there, but it's good to see that there are others who are coming along.
I agree. I think that we can't afford to be the exception. This way of organizing social impact has to become more the norm. And I'm glad you brought up, Bank of America, because we just issued our first sustainability bond, and Bank of America was our advisor there. And part of that was because there is such an alignment on the social purpose side of it. It didn't take any time to get to the place of saying, how are we going to think about a sustainability bond and the framework and the measurements and, what counts and what doesn't count? Because there was such a synergy in terms of, sort of that sort of an evolving vocabulary around social impact, but I think an environmental impact, inclusive growth and sustainable growth, sort of like the intersection between inclusive growth and environmental growth, and how those two things can't be mutually exclusive. But there are a number of companies who are, maybe they've been very strong in the environmental space, maybe some have been very strong in the social impact space. And now I think what's interesting is these two things are now intersecting in a way that I think is also something we should be replicating. But to answer your question more specifically, Elwood, I think companies do it for different reasons. So we're seeing ESG become such an important part of what companies have to measure themselves against, how it needs to be central to their, to their work. And a lot of that comes, I think, because you have people like Larry Fink and other big investment houses saying, we're going to start to look at this and we're going to count this as something that we look at in terms of investment. That's a really important thing, because for companies who may not be thinking about it or who may not be as driven organically by it, it's a really important thing when an investor says, this is going to become part of our strategy for looking at our investments. The only other thing I'd say is, and maybe this unfortunately hasn't been replicated as much as I'd like to see, is that when Mastercard went public, 11% of the stock went to create an independent Mastercard Foundation. And so that foundation is now valued at over $30 billion and working almost exclusively in Africa around livelihoods. And so when you have a foundation as your largest shareholder, it does also set the tone for how you do your work and why you do your work. And I don't think that anybody looking, at least today, at Mastercard stock can sort of argue with the fact that we've seen success and it hasn't been at the cost of something else. And so to the extent that we can, think Lata, myself, there are others who would like nothing more than for this model to become the norm. I think we hold ourselves out there in the right way to sort of say, would be happy to partner, would be happy to work, would be happy to share learnings, coach on how to do it. And I think with USC sort of like bringing us out here and sort of featuring this is a place I think where also you could be of enormous value to these organizations who are trying to get there, but may not know how.
We've been building some blocks here towards a big question I want to ask, which is about scale. Because again, please push back on me, correct me if I'm wrong, but I am increasingly seeing such potential in the market and the private sector as a vehicle to scale, where we have often spoken of the public policy route as the only route. And I'd like you to reflect on that. I mean, one possible issue is the nonprofit infrastructure that's in the world today, is it the right infrastructure? Is it strong enough? Is it at scale? When you're describing the intermediaries involved in growing some of these sectors or increasing digital access or in creating career pipelines for certain jobs, does the nonprofit infrastructure look as extensive and robust, and does it possess the right competencies to get you there? What are some other issues around, fulfilling the potential of scale that you see?
I think it varies, right, in terms of the nonprofit sector, and it plays out differently in different communities. I think, unfortunately, in many cases, it can be quite fragmented, and so there's a little bit of money going to a lot of different organizations, so nobody can really get to a scale where they can deliver the way they, perhaps need to. I think there's an opportunity to look in a place differently. And so, one need, I think, for further investment is this notion of backbone organizations. And so, right, the non-jargony definition is really just an organization that, right, can help align a cross-sector group of organizations to aim at a shared purpose, and then create, right, a shared set of activities that are co-created, but lead on that and aggregate funding and do all the things you need to do to be effective. But, to see more investments in those kinds of things that can then continue to invest in the direct service organizations on the front line versus all of us investing in, right, a scattershot approach, I think we can be more effective and make the nonprofits much more effective.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I actually think that it's more of a roles and responsibilities issue, right? So I don't think it's that public sector or private sector or nonprofit sector aren't able to do any of these things. I think that there's something about what I talked about earlier about, doing what we do, but doing what we do by doing what we do best. And so, so if government, I think public sector government, like, they have a job to do, like, that's, protect citizens, make sure that they're creating the enabling environment for markets to function. I think civil society has a piece that, is about making sure that me as a citizen, is protected by, the bad actors of the world, and also have an ability to travel and vote and do all of the things that I want to do in a democracy in a safe and secure way. I think, companies have an ability to scale. They have an ability to, for speed, and they have an ability for efficiency. And, this goes back to the first question. It's like, when there's an ability for companies like ours or for others to leverage their assets for social impact, that's when you see, like, exponential change. And so I think that it's about, sort of making sure, or at least trying to make sure that, we're aligning the responsibilities and we're aligning the best of government with the best of the social sector, with the best of private sector companies to achieve impact for people like you and me, and always in service of citizens who, I think you said earlier, Elwood, don't separate themselves by, taxpayer versus consumer versus voter versus family member. So we're all the same person. And I hope that the sectors can come together to serve us in a way that makes sense.
Two excellent answers. I think, being able to kind of give consolidated, sustainable support to the infrastructure that can extend your reach, and then also having some narratives about economic inclusion and financial security that allow all the sectors to organize themselves. I always say so much work in society is the work of you need the mind of a closet organizer. It's like, this is your blouse is here, your sweater's here, your shoes here. What you're good at, you should do. What you're good at, you should do. And I think that there's what you are doing, that both of you are doing, is bringing some stories and narratives about what's possible at scale that I think makes it easier for different sectors to get involved.
Elwood, can I just jump in for one?
Of course.
Because I actually think that it's a really important point. I mean, I started out as a political organizer, have been a labor organizer, worked in, you can look at the bio, but sort of worked in the public sector, worked, in the Clinton administration and on the House and the things like that. And then I came over to the private sector and have spent, 15 years on this side of the house. But the truth of the matter is, I've seen it all. And so I can, I'm really speaking from having been in all of these places. Everybody's intention in the different sectors, I think, is that I've seen is to do the right thing for what their job is. And so the intention has never been malicious. And so, but I think what stops is this, there is a trust issue between all of these different sectors that I think we have to overcome, or we have to at least be honest about and address, so that we can work through it and get past it. And so I often say that, the new disruptor is sort of the translator between all of these different sectors, because really this tri-sector leadership and bringing all of this stuff together it has to be the thing that takes us forward. So I would encourage people who are in the public sector to take some time and get some experience in the private sector. For private sector people, go get seconded and go work in a social sector organization for a while. Share some experiences so that we actually understand what each other's perspectives are, and then can sort of come back together and say, now here's a strategy that might help all of us.
Yeah, it's this trust. I'd like to, as we sort of dig into some final questions, I want to dig into this trust issue a little bit, because a lot of the audience listening today are probably foundation CEOs, people working in philanthropy, and I know many of them in personal conversations with me will often express skepticism about corporate partnerships. I know you both you collaborate with other foundations, but I also know that there are headwinds there, and that one of the sort of the dominant stories is that, they're just about marketing and they're just trying to put their brand out there, as though that's a purely negative thing and doesn't carry any other work. And I feel like you've both answered that question very well. But what about people who would say, and forgive me, we're getting into a hard topic now, perhaps, but some people would say that, many corporations, especially older ones, have really been participants in a lot of the racial injustice, a lot of the exclusion. Does that ever come up where, this is a time in history when we're talking about, reparations and historic impacts of corporations that were formed sometimes 100, 150 years ago? Does that ever haunt you in your work? I know Mastercard is a newer company, so perhaps this is more of, not to put you on the spot, Lata, but I guess here we are. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm happy to take that question because it's something we've done a great deal of thinking and talking about. So, again, Prudential, a 145-year-old company. And as such, we've ridden the waves of American history, and that includes the good, the bad, and the ugly. And as a legacy company, there are moments in our history where we weren't on the right side of history. And we knew that it was important to, delve into that, to understand that, and to examine our past practices that, unfortunately, in some cases, negatively impacted Black Americans in particular. And so we know that we can't go forward without understanding from whence we've come, right, and why that was the case, and therefore what we need to do to move forward. And it was in the vein of moving forward. But I'll tell you, we had a town hall on this very topic called Owning Our Past. And it was an all-employee town hall. Over 3,000 employees showed up and thousands more watched the replay. So many people were involved in this conversation. But we brought in a historian, Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad from Harvard, to talk about this, right? And talk about the impact of specifically financial services companies and insurance companies, again, within that segment. And, to understand why we are where we are today because of some of the actions that were taken, and then engaged in a conversation. And that's a conversation we're still having, and we know it's important to have. And so we are trying to reckon with that and, move forward accordingly, because what we know is, right, it's part of our story, but it can't be our legacy.
Oh, it's a great answer. And by the way, thank you for being so graceful with a hard question. And I also want to ask you one other follow-up, Lata, because I'm not sure everyone listening today knows. When I have been in your headquarters in Newark, I don't know if it's still there, but in the lobby, there's a lot of history. It's almost like a little mini museum there. Like there's pictures and storyline. Could you just say a few words about how the company actually started? Because I feel like that's an important piece of the story that that has to be included with what you just said.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It is an important part of our story. We are, we're actually a purpose-built company. So our founder, John Dryden, when he created the company, did so to serve working families who at the time were shut out of the insurance market and financial services more broadly. And so specifically, he created burial insurance. And we sold it for as little as 3 cents a week. And that's how Prudential was born. And so that ethos, right, that through line carries through our history. Not what I said notwithstanding, but that's our touchstone. That is what we try to, pull forward in everything we do.
Shamina, is there anything you'd add? Again, I know it's a newer company, but any thoughts on this question of sort of racial equity and the role of corporations and just in their long view life?
Yeah, I mean, look, I talked about it, I think, earlier in terms of, we're a community of people who work at Mastercard. And so as part of that microcosm, I think we have a really unique role to play in terms of coming together as a community to figure this out and to talk it through. And that's kind of what we've been doing. And it's not easy, and it's not a straight line, and it's really hard. But I think if you are clear on the values of the company, right? So I think that there's this piece around a very basic belief in decency, obviously, and another piece that sort of says, keep your hand on somebody's back, not in their face. You can have conversations that sort of respect each other as individuals, but get to a place that sort of also says, yeah, we do need to have racial reckoning. There is a problem in this country. And by the way, there's also a problem around income inequality. Like that's real. And so I think that, for us to, sort of sit inside, companies or anywhere we're sitting and sort of pretend that some of this stuff isn't real or isn't happening it's doing a disservice to each other, but to ourselves as individuals. Like, don't deny the reality. And I think that that's sort of the, have the courage, but just sort of have the decency to say, let's talk to each other about what's going on here. And then let's try to figure it out a path forward. And then let's figure out how do you use your assets to actually address the issue. And so that's where you get to the solution. And we have it, and we've got a lot of stuff going in terms of the solidarity work that I talked about before. But in order to get there, we have to be able to be honest with ourselves and really have the tough conversations as a community of people who work for a company. And, the other thing Elwood, I think about this a lot is that, people, my friends and, folks like that are sort of like, you talked about, they say why do companies do this or companies do that? And there's cynicism around that. I get it. And so what I also don't want to do is sort of say that, there are there are companies who are getting this right, and there are companies who are not getting this right. And I think we also need to tell the truth about that. And I'm not defending all the companies in the world. Like, I'm not somebody who is saying I defend all private sector, but I'm also somebody who's not saying I defend all public sector, because I've been in both. And I've seen where public sector actors get it wrong a lot. And so that's where you have social sector actors who are sort of trying to also advocate. But to sort of say any one company or any one sector gets it all right or gets it all wrong denies the reality and, frankly, the complexity of what we're all, I think, working on here. So I did sort of, and I admire Lata and I admire Prudential for sort of having the tough conversation to say, yeah, this is what this company is. This is what our legacy, or this is how we were started, but it's not our legacy. I sort of feel like we, at some level, we do need to give each other a little bit of space, but also not give each other enough birth so that we are defending bad actors, because I don't want to do that. And I also always want to be held accountable for what we can do. That's a good thing. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's sort of like, I think we should also be real and really honest about a lot of these issues, because they're not easy and they didn't happen 2 days ago or 2 years ago. They've been happening over hundreds of years.
Well, I know a point to end on when I hear it. And Lata, Shamina, I want to thank you so much for being so generous, forthright, and so smart on these issues. And it's very clear to me that because you each bring your full selves to your work, that it actually helps your companies to bring their full selves to the world. And I hope that we can invite you back to the center and continue this conversation. But for now, I'm going to thank you for taking the time to let us into your world today.
Thank you.
Thank you.